Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to continue my reviews of C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy by talking about the second book in the series Perelandra by C.S. Lewis. So I did a review a couple weeks ago on the first book in the series. It's a trilogy, the Space Trilogy, or sometimes called the Ransom Trilogy after the main character, on Out of the Silent Planet. I finished reading Perelandra a couple of weeks ago actually now, so I'm running behind on the video reviews as is kind of my standard practice, and I'm listening to That Hideous Strength right now, so I'll have a review coming out on that hopefully in the next couple of weeks. But today I want to share my thoughts on this second book in the series. As I did with Out of the Silent Planet, I'll just give the disclaimer up front that I'm going to be giving spoilers, so if you have not read the book and would like to sort of encounter the story on your own terms for the first time, turn off this video now. But otherwise, I'm looking forward to just reflecting on it a little bit with you now. So Perelandra is the second book in the Space Trilogy that C.S. Lewis wrote. You'll remember, if you watched my first video review, that this is actually a series that Lewis wrote before he wrote the Narnia series. Even though for many of us, as we're reading Lewis, we encounter Narnia first, and then we get to things like the Space Trilogy. But the Space Trilogy actually predates the Narnia books by about 10 or 15 years, being written more around the time of World War II, whereas the Narnia books are kind of being written in the 50s. It is following the character of this professor, Dr. Ransom, who ends up in the first book being kind of kidnapped and taken to another planet by these two men, Weston and Divine. And Weston is sort of the evil scientist character in a sense, who's very mercenary. He has as his goal and aim the preservation of humanity, and he wants to be able to find a way for humans to live on other planets so they can perpetuate the human race and kind of expand throughout the galaxy. And he's willing to do whatever is necessary to do that, even if it means sacrificing people like Ransom. In fact, he brings Ransom to Melicandra, which is the planet that they're on in the first book, in order to sacrifice him, even though turns out he wasn't being asked to be a sacrifice. But he's a main character in the book, in that first book. Now, the reason I go back into that background is because you need to have some sense of that if you're going to make sense of Perelandra, because we pick up back on Earth after those characters from the first book have gone to Mars or Melicandra and then been sent back by the Oyarsa, who is like the spiritual being who's in charge of that planet. And we pick up with this story back in England. And interestingly, it actually begins with C.S. Lewis in the beginning of the book. He's a character that he's written himself into these stories in a kind of peripheral role. And the story begins with Lewis going to visit his friend, Dr. Ransom, and he finds out that Ransom has asked him to come because he needs him to basically pack him into this box, this spaceship, and send him off to another planet, Perelandra, right? So Melicandra is based on the planet Mars. Perelandra is based on the planet Venus. And so we begin with Lewis meeting with Ransom and packing him into this spaceship, but in which he's going to be transported by Oyarsa to this new planet. And he's being sent to this planet to do something. He doesn't really know what it is. He just knows that the powers that be, as it were, have asked him to go to this planet to do something. So already you can see that if you're going to track with this book, you really need to have read the first book, right? Which is, some series are like that. And I would say this is a series where having that background knowledge is going to be helpful, because Lewis just jumps in. He talks about Oyarsa, Melicandra, Weston, all these different characters. And if you don't know who that is, you're not going to track with this as well. However, if you've got that background, you'll be with us so far. Ransom gets sent to Perelandra, and from that point on in the story, really what we're doing is just following Ransom as he arrives on the planet of Perelandra and as the story unfolds. What Lewis is doing, in essence, in this story, what ends up happening is that Ransom discovers that he has come to Perelandra, or Venus, at the point where mankind is being made on this earth. So he is coming, in essence, at kind of the beginning or the creation point of life on this planet. And so he is stepping into what is, in essence, the creation story, the story of Adam and Eve. So when he comes to Perelandra, the world has already been formed. It's populated by different creatures and things, but the first man and the first woman are the only humans on this planet. And when he arrives, he quickly meets up with the first woman, kind of the Eve figure, but the first man has been lost. They got separated at some point, and so he meets with her and begins to talk to her and kind of begins to understand what's going on. And it's at that point that another visitor from Earth arrives, and it turns out to be Dr. Weston, the kind of villain from the first book. And what Ransom kind of discovers is that Weston has come to basically tempt the Eve figure into the fall, into sin, to disobey the commands that she's been given, to basically effect the fall of this world. And so Ransom comes to realize his job is somehow to stop the fall from happening on this other planet, to be the kind of counterbalance or, voice for good in this world that at this point is created and is unspoiled, but has not been perfected and is not fallen into sin. And so it's a really interesting kind of premise or plot to sort of bring us back into the story of our own world by looking at the beginning of this story on another world. So Lewis, obviously, from a literary perspective, is echoing the Genesis story first and foremost, but also if you enjoy Western literature, you'll hear a lot of echoes of Paradise Lost, because in essence what Lewis is doing is giving his version of Paradise Lost in the setting of a space trilogy, which is a very C.S. Lewis thing to do. So as Lewis does this, the heart of this then is the struggle then that takes place between he and Weston as they're each kind of trying to sway the woman, this kind of Eve figure there on Perelandra. And so you end up having the contest between them. At the beginning, this is a battle of words, as it were, and they're both kind of trying to convince and bring the woman onto their side. Weston trying to push her away from the commands that she's been given by God, in essence, and Ransom trying to call her back to those commands. So you see this battle unfolding kind of in the realm of temptation, as it were, spiritual warfare in that sense. Later then, Weston and Ransom actually engage in a physical contest, and they end up going down into the depths of the planet, and Ransom ends up being victorious over Weston, killing him, and the planet is delivered from this threat of evil. And so the final scenes are the man and the woman, the kind of Adam and Eve figure, being united again, being kind of crowned as the king and queen of creation, and the created world there of Perelandra is then entering into an estate that our world never did, because our parents fell into sin, whereas these endured. And so along the way, as you can imagine, Lewis has ample room here to have all sorts of interesting theological and philosophical and mythical reflections and echoes. He does a lot of very creative world building, and it's a book that's rich in ideas. I remember reading this for the first time when I was a teenager. I had read Out of the Silent Planet, and I enjoyed it, although I don't think I got it as I look back, but I enjoyed it because there was kind of a normal plot and characters and things. I remember reading Perelandra as a teen and really feeling a little kind of lost, and then I remember trying to read that Hideous Strength, and I didn't even make it through the first couple times I tried to read it. Did finally end up reading it later in life, absolutely loved it. I'm rereading it now, like I said, and I'm really loving it, so I'll look forward to doing a review in a little bit. But I think that speaks to the fact that Perelandra is, I would argue, a beautiful book and a powerful book, but it is not the most easily accessible book. If you go look at the kind of reviews online, just kind of gauging ordinary people's thoughts, this is a very divisive book in one sense. There's some people who absolutely love it, who say it's their favorite C.S. Lewis book or their favorite book in the trilogy of the space trilogy, and others who just say feels like Lewis missed the mark. And part of that is Lewis goes in for a lot of description. So a lot of the story here is either just description, and he'll go on for pages just sort of describing the world and what Ransom is doing and things, or it's straight dialogue when you get kind of into the second act of the book, and you have the battle between Weston and Ransom and the conversations they're having with the woman. A lot of it will just be straight dialogue. So in terms of sort of action that you can plot out, it's fairly light on action. It has some moments of action at the beginning, some moments at the end, but the heart of the book is a lot of either just sort of describing the world that they're in and Ransom's thoughts and reflections on the world, or just a kind of account of the dialogue. So it has its demands on the reader in that sense. However, if you're willing to just sort of give yourself over to what Lewis is doing, I think you'll be richly rewarded. There's a lot of fascinating, again, thoughts and reflections on the nature of sin, the nature of temptation, the nature of perfection, the nature of creation. He introduces more thoughts on his very interesting and rich cosmology. I don't know that I could fully communicate at this point my understanding Lewis's actual views on some things. The relationship of earth to the heavens, the relationship of mythology to theology, but he's pointing to all of these things in this book. So I feel like there's more to plumb there than I've grasped in my read through of this series again, but there's a lot there to work with. I feel like if I was a lit major, I'd be wanting to write papers and explore those things more deeply. But if you have a kind of appetite for those ideas, then I think you'll find a lot to enjoy from this book in particular. And it is just a beautiful book. The way he portrays Perelandra, the way he describes the characters, the scenery, the world building, it's really beautiful and very richly imagined. And one of the things that he explores that's interesting is kind of the relationship that we have with beauty or with pleasure, because while Malacandra, Mars, is kind of described as an older planet that's colder, and even though it's not broken and fallen in the way that our world is, it still has a strangeness and otherness, a kind of harshness to it. Venus, Perelandra, is described, as you would imagine, right, as being a place of kind of sensuality, but not in a sinful or sexual way. In fact, that's one of the points that Lewis goes into great lengths to make, that what Ransom feels like is like he's experiencing pleasure both more keenly than he ever has before, and yet also more purely than he ever has before. I think this is one of the ideas of Lewis's that I absolutely love, because part of what he's trying to, I think, help us see is that in our common way of thinking, sin is where pleasure is. Holiness may be better in the sense of being more pure or more right, but it's not more beautiful, it's not more good as we kind of think about that experience of pleasure. But the biblical imagery, the Christian imagery, is actually that sin is the cheap knockoff, it's the imitation, it's the perversion, it's the negation of that which is truly true and good and beautiful. And so Lewis here has a very Christian and Augustinian and kind of Neoplatonic, I would say, recognition, if we think about Christian Platonism I'm talking about here, that the real good, the highest good, the truest pleasure is actually found in God and in using the things that God has made rightly. And so he has a lot of interesting explorations on that theme, and it's just one example of many things that he does. So this is a book that, like I said, not everybody loves, but I think if you have in mind what Lewis is doing and that he's using this story, which is again a biblical story and a kind of core mythical story, to explore and develop ideas and themes and images, then you'll begin to see the depth of what he's doing. So I enjoyed this book. I love it. I would highly recommend everyone to read or reread the second book in the Space Trilogy by C.S. Lewis, Perelandra.